The ropes cut deep into their small wrists, pale skin ridged and angry where the hemp had bitten. Dust clung to their bare feet, the kind that lifted in lazy spirals each time they shifted their weight. One girl, 5, maybe, stood straighter, chin trembling but high. The other pressed her cheek to the sun-warmed wood of the old station pillar, eyes darting toward the unmoving figure sprawled on the ground a few feet away. The mother's face was turned to the earth, her dark hair matted with grit. Her dress was torn near the hem, revealing bruises in shades of storm cloud and ochre. She breathed shallowly, as though each one had to be bargained for. Flies settled and rose again in slow, indifferent waves. Jesse Cartwright reined in hard, the leather creaking beneath his hands. He'd been riding the old cattle trail, tracing the fence line for breaks, when the flicker of movement in the corner of his eye stopped him cold. For a heartbeat, he thought they were fence posts, thin and still in the glare of noon, but then the taller girl turned her head, and the hollow defiance in her eyes rooted him to the saddle. "Take our mom." The words were thin, breaking against the air like brittle twigs. "She is dying." Jesse swung down without thinking, boots crunching the gravel scattered along the tracks. The station had been dead for 40 years, a place trains no longer touched, its roof sagging like a tired back. A windless silence hung over it, as if even sound had forgotten the way here. He crouched before them, fingers brushing the rope. It was knotted tight, the kind of knot meant to last until nothing remained to untie. His thumb pressed gently against their wrists, feeling the hot pulse beneath. "Who did this?" His voice came low, quiet enough not to spook them. The smaller girl's mouth trembled. The older one answered without blinking. "Mama's people." Behind him, his horse snorted, stamping a hoof. Jesse turned his gaze to the woman on the ground. Her lips were cracked, her skin hot under the shadow of his hand. He poured the last of his canteen into her mouth, slow and careful, watching her throat work weakly to swallow. He'd seen cruelty before, too much for his 25 years, but something about this scene gnawed at the old scar tissue inside him. Maybe it was the rope around wrists not yet big enough for a man's palm. Maybe it was the way the taller girl stood between him and her mother, like a post driven into hard ground. He cut the ropes with his pocket knife. The older girl flexed her hands silently. The younger whimpered when the blood rushed back. Jesse slid his coat off and wrapped it around both of them, pulling the edges snug until they stopped shaking. "You got names." "Sadie," the older said. "Lila," whispered the smaller, her eyes still fixed on the woman in the dust. Jesse nodded, more to himself than to them. "I'm Jesse." Sadie blinked at him, wary. "You talking us?" He looked out past the tracks, over the brittle grass to the horizon. No one was coming for them, no rider, no wagon, no mercy. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm talking you." He lifted Mara, he'd learn her name later, with a care that made his arms ache more than her weight. She was lighter than she should have been, all bone and silence. Sadie and Lila trailed close, the coat slipping as they walked. At the edge of the station, Jesse stopped. The old telegraph pole leaned toward the ground like it was trying to listen. He thought of the years it had stood there, watching trains pass, hearing messages meant for others. Now it bore only the echo of ropes and small bodies. He settled Mara across his saddle and swung up behind her, steadying her with one arm. "Climb up," he told Sadie. She hesitated, then pulled Lila with her, both fitting between him and the horn. Their shoulders were sharp under his hands. The horse shifted, impatient, as if sensing Jesse's own unease. He glanced once more at the station, its windows black as shut eyes. The air here felt wrong, like the aftermath of something that still lingered. Halfway down the trail, Sadie spoke again. "They said wolves would eat us." "Who said?" Jesse asked, though he already guessed. "Our uncle," she answered. "Said he had to protect the animals. 300 head, he said. We weren't worth that." Jesse's jaw locked. He kept his gaze forward, on the slow dip of the land ahead. He didn't ask where their father was. The silence around that question felt too raw to touch. The sun slid west, staining the grass with long shadows. The girls grew heavy against him, their small bodies surrendering to exhaustion. Mara stirred once, a faint moan escaping her lips, then went still again. When they reached the rise that gave sight to his ranch, Jesse slowed. The place looked smaller than he remembered, a patchwork of weathered boards, a lean-to stable, fences that bowed where nails had given up. He thought of the gossip in town, how quick folks were to see trouble where none was their own. He could almost hear it already, Cartwrights bringing strangers under his roof. Kemp's kin, no less. The thought flickered and died as he reined toward the barn. The girls slid down, Sadie steadying Lila. Jesse lifted Mara again, feeling the heat still radiating from her skin. Inside, the air was cooler, the scent of hay mingling with the faint tang of oil from his tools. He laid her on a blanket in the corner, tucking the edges around her shoulders. Sadie crouched beside her, holding her mother's hand in both of hers. Lila sat close enough for her knee to touch Jesse's boot. Outside, a horse whinnied, not his. Jesse's head came up, every muscle tightening. Through the barn door, a shadow moved along the ridge, too far to see a face but close enough to know they were watching. He stayed still, one hand lowering toward the rifle propped against the wall. The figure lingered, then turned away, vanishing beyond the hill. Jesse looked down at the girls. "You're safe now," he said, though a part of him knew safety was a promise a man couldn't make. Not out here, not with the likes of the Kemps breathing the same air. Still, he meant it. And that, he thought, might be enough to start with. Morning slid in without ceremony, a thin wash of gold spilling over the hills and into Jesse Cartwright's tired yard. The air carried the damp scent of dew, though the boards beneath the girls' bare feet still felt cool from the night. Inside the barn, Mara's shallow breathing had steadied. She hadn't yet opened her eyes, but her color was less death-like. Jesse had risen early, moving with the careful quiet of a man who knew the value of not startling small creatures. He'd lit the stove in his cabin, the fire's glow flickering across the plain wooden walls. On the table, he set out tin bowls, pouring the last of the cornmeal into a pot. The smell of cooking mush crept through the space, coaxing the girls closer. Sadie entered first, holding Lila's hand as if it were the last rope in a flood. She hesitated on the threshold, glancing at the single bed, the small shelf of folded shirts, the bare windows. Jesse gestured toward the table, and when neither moved, he fetched 2 chairs and set them close to the stove. They ate in silence, the scrape of spoons against tin the only sound. Jesse noticed the way Sadie's eyes flicked to the door every few moments, as if expecting someone to barge in and drag them back. Lila, too young to mask her worry, clutched the coat he'd given them last night, pulling it tighter around her narrow frame. When they'd finished, Jesse rinsed the bowls in the basin by the window. "Your ma's gonna need some water when she wakes," he said, his voice even. "Reckon you two can help me fetch it?" They followed him outside to the pump near the barn. Sadie worked the handle with stiff determination, her thin arms straining. Lila crouched beside the bucket, watching the water pour in. Jesse didn't rush them. There was something in the rhythm of the pump that eased the morning's tension. As they carried the bucket back, Sadie spoke, her voice small but steady. "Uncle Virgil says Pa's not comin' back. Says wolves mighta got him." Jesse kept walking. "You believe that?" She shook her head. "No. But Lila does. She cries at night." Lila pressed her lips together and looked away. Jesse reached down, taking the bucket from Sadie before the weight bent her arms too far. "Some men say things they want to be true," he said. "Doesn't make 'em so." Back in the barn, Mara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed at first, then sharpening with the wariness of someone waking in a stranger's place. She tried to sit up, but Jesse was there, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Easy. You're safe." Her gaze flicked to her daughters, who had rushed to her side. She cupped the back of their heads, her fingers trembling. "Sadie." "Lila." Her voice cracked on the names. "You passed out at the station," Jesse told her. "I couldn't leave you there." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether kindness could be trusted. Finally she nodded, but her hand tightened around her girl's shoulders. "They'll come for us," she murmured. "They won't let it be." Jesse didn't ask who they were. He'd seen the kind of men who believed cruelty was their birthright. He only said, "Then we'll be ready." By midday, Mara had taken a few sips of water and eaten half a slice of bread. Jesse busied himself outside, fixing a sagging hinge on the barn door. He was aware of the 3 pairs of eyes watching from the cabin's window, 2 wide and curious, 1 shadowed with doubt. In town, the news would already be circling. He could almost hear the low murmur in the saloon, the way names slipped from one mouth to another until a story was born, and with it, judgment. The Kemp name traveled fast, and Virgil's shadow stretched longer than the noon sun. That afternoon, Jesse saddled his horse. "Need to fetch supplies," he told the girls. Sadie straightened, but Lila gripped her mother's skirt. Mara shook her head. "Don't take them into town. Folks will talk." "They'll talk whether I do or don't," Jesse said. "Better they see the girls with someone who won't hand 'em back." The ride into town was slow, the girls seated behind him, their small hands hooked into his belt. Dust puffed up around the horses' hooves, curling in the warm air. When they reached Main Street, every porch seemed to sprout eyes. Jesse dismounted, lifting the girls down. Inside the general store, Mrs. Pickens glanced over her spectacles, her mouth tightening before softening into a polite smile. "Well now, Jesse. Didn't know you had company." "Just gettin' what we need," Jesse replied, setting flour, beans, and salt on the counter. Sadie wandered to a barrel of peppermint sticks, her gaze fixed but her hands still at her sides. Jesse added a small paper sack of them to his pile without comment. On the way out, he spotted Virgil's cousin, Clancy, leaning against a post. The man's grin didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you been collectin' strays," Clancy said, his tone oily. "That's a dangerous hobby." Jesse kept walking, but the heat in his chest flared. Sadie's hand slipped into his. Back at the ranch, as the sun dipped low, Jesse found Mara sitting outside the barn, the girls at her feet. She looked stronger, though her eyes still held the haunted gleam of someone expecting the worst. "They'll try soon," she said quietly, watching the horizon. "Then I'll be here," Jesse answered. She studied him, and for the first time, there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. Not trust, not yet, but something leaning in that direction. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, sharp and brief. Jesse followed her gaze to the far ridge, where a lone rider sat silhouetted against the dying light, watching. This time, the figure didn't turn away. The next morning broke with a brittle light, the kind that made every shadow look sharper. Jesse saddled the mare without hurry, yet his movements carried the weight of someone bracing for a day that might tilt against him. Mara stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cool air, her eyes narrowed as if she could already see the road they'd take. The girls hovered behind her skirts, their heads poking out like cautious birds. "We'll be back by noon," Jesse said, adjusting the cinch. "Need flour, nails, and some medicine for your ma." Mara hesitated, then nodded. Sadie stepped forward without waiting for permission, her chin set in the same stubborn line Jesse had noticed the day he found them. Lila followed, clutching a rag doll missing one button eye. The ride into town was quiet, the rhythm of hooves on packed dirt the only sound. The prairie opened wide on either side, grasses trembling under a faint breeze. As the first buildings of Cedar Hollow came into view, Jesse felt the shift, air tightening, glances waiting. They dismounted outside the mercantile. Conversations on the porch slowed, then fell into that particular silence that only comes when strangers walk into a room where everyone knows each other's names. Jesse tipped his hat toward Mrs. Pickens behind the counter. "Well now," she said, voice light but eyes quick. "Didn't know you were keepin' company, Jesse." "They're with me," he said simply, setting a list on the counter. Sadie wandered toward a row of jars filled with penny candy, her eyes lingering but her hands folded neatly in front of her. Lila stayed close, glancing toward the door as though it might open on trouble. The door did open, just as Jesse was counting coins into Mrs. Pickens's palm, and in stepped Reverend Amos Thatcher. His black coat looked heavy for the season, the fabric brushing the floor like a judgment made flesh. "Morning, Jesse," the Reverend said, his tone somewhere between greeting and warning. His gaze slid to the girls. "I heard you've taken in kin of the Kemp family." Jesse met his eyes. "I've taken in 2 children and their ma." The Reverend's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Some burdens aren't meant to be carried by one man. The Lord helps those who mind their own load." Jesse didn't answer. Words, he knew, were sometimes just bait. Outside, the street stretched dusty and still, but not empty. Virgil Kemp's cousin Clancy leaned against the hitch rail, a toothpick shifting between his teeth. His smile didn't touch his eyes. "Cartwright," Clancy drawled. "Heard you got yourself tangled in family business. That's unwise." Jesse walked past without slowing. Sadie's small hand found his, her grip tight enough to tell him she'd understood every word. At the blacksmith's, Jesse traded for nails and a whetstone. While the girls waited by the trough, he caught sight of Mara across the street, leaning against the doctor's doorway. She'd come into town after all, her hair tied back, her steps deliberate. When she crossed to him, the air between them carried something unspoken, gratitude tangled with caution. "You didn't have to bring them here," she said quietly. "World's easier to face when you're not hidin' from it," he replied. They left town as the church bell tolled noon. The road back felt different, heavier, though nothing had been said outright. The eyes that followed them had spoken enough. Back at the ranch, Jesse unloaded supplies. Mara took the medicine without a word, but her gaze kept straying toward the horizon. "Virgil doesn't like to be made a fool," she said finally. "If he thinks you're standin' between him and what he wants." "I've stood between worse men and worse intentions," Jesse said. She gave him a long look, as if weighing whether that was bravado or truth. That evening, the girls played in the yard, their laughter faint but real. Jesse sat on the porch, mending a bridle, watching the light drain from the sky. The scent of wood smoke from the stove drifted out, warm and steady. Then a horse's cry split the calm. Jesse stood, scanning the ridge. A lone rider was silhouetted against the bruised sky, not moving, just watching. Mara stepped outside, following his gaze. Her breath caught. "That's him," she said, voice low. "That's Virgil." The rider turned his horse, the figure shrinking into the dusk until only the memory of him remained. Jesse set the bridle aside. The quiet that settled after was not peace, it was the space before something broke. The next days carried a tension that clung like burrs to wool. The ridge above the ranch seemed to grow eyes. Jesse could feel them on his back when he hauled water, when he saddled the mare, even when he stepped into the barn's cool shadow. One morning, hoofbeats rolled across the hills, slow, deliberate, like someone taking stock of the land before claiming it. Virgil Kemp and 2 riders crested the far slope. They didn't come close. They just sat their horses, silhouettes cut sharp against the pale sky, letting the message settle. They knew exactly where Jesse's roof stood, and they weren't in any hurry. Mara saw them from the yard. She said nothing, but her hands tightened around the wash she was wringing, water dripping faster through her fingers. The girls, sensing the shift, grew quieter, sticking close to the porch steps. By midday, the riders were gone, but the air they disturbed didn't settle. Jesse spent the afternoon moving his small herd to the back pasture, where the ground rose enough to give him a clear view. He kept the rifle within arm's reach even while mending fence wire, the barrel glinting each time the sun broke the clouds. That night, Mara found him sitting at the kitchen table, oiling the rifle in small, methodical motions. The lamp between them threw a warm circle on the wood, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. "They'll come soon," she said quietly. "You sound certain. I've seen Virgil wait before. He's patient, but only till he thinks patience makes him look weak. That's when he does something foolish." Jesse studied her across the lamp's glow. "What's he after, Mara? It's not just about you and the girls, is it?" Her gaze faltered. "Your guess is right enough." She drew a slow breath, then added, "Their father stood in Virgil's way once. And I reckon Virgil plans to finish what he started, him and anyone close." The words settled heavy between them. Jesse thought of the quiet resolve in Sadie's small shoulders, the way Lila clung to her rag doll as if its worn seams could hold the world together. He felt the old ache in his chest, the one that came when the scales between right and safe tipped in opposite directions. The following afternoon, Sheriff Wyatt Briggs rode up, his badge catching the light. He dismounted with a dust-slowed gait, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch. "Jesse," he said, "word is you've got Kemp's kin under your roof. That a problem for the law?" Jesse asked. Briggs glanced toward the barn, where the girls' voices carried faintly. "Not unless trouble starts. But trouble has a way of following the Kemps, and I'd hate to see it land here." "Then maybe you ought to tell Virgil to keep his distance," Jesse said. The sheriff's eyes thinned, but he only tipped his hat. "Just keepin' you informed." When he rode off, the dust from his horse hung in the air, slow to fall. That evening, Jesse began making quiet preparations. He reinforced the barn doors, checked the hinges on the cabin shutters, and laid an extra bedroll near the hearth for the girls, closer to him than their room in the loft. He taught Sadie a low, two-note whistle and told her to use it if she saw riders near. She nodded solemnly, repeating the sound until it was steady. Mara watched from the porch. "You think it'll come to that?" "I think it's better to be ready than sorry," he said. The next morning, a folded scrap of paper was nailed to the front post. The handwriting was crude but legible. "Dawn tomorrow. Be ready to hand 'em over." Jesse read it twice, then slid it into his pocket. The sun was still low, the grass silvered with dew, but the day already felt sharpened. Mara found him saddling the mare. "What did it say?" He met her eyes. "They'll be here in the morning." She swallowed hard, glancing toward the cabin where the girls were still sleeping. "You can walk away, Jesse. You owe us nothing." "That's not how I measure debt," he said. For a moment, the only sound was the leather creaking under his hands. Then Mara stepped closer. "If something happens to you." "It won't." The words came steady, but a muscle worked in his jaw. That night, Jesse sat alone by the fire, the rifle across his knees. The shadows in the room shifted with each flicker of flame. Outside, the wind rose, rustling the grass in long sighs. He thought of wolves, the real kind, and how they circled just beyond the light until they knew exactly when to strike. He could feel Virgil out there, pacing the dark in daylight's memory. When the fire dropped to embers, Jesse looked toward the door, knowing dawn would bring more than the sun. Dawn came without birdsong. The air stretched thin over the land. Jesse was already outside, boots planted in the frost-tipped grass, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Behind him, the cabin's windows glowed faintly with lamplight. Inside, Mara sat with the girls, their faces pale in the dimness. The horizon cracked with movement. 3 riders, Virgil at the lead, cutting across the slope with the confidence of men who believed they owned the ground they rode on. Their horses' breath steamed in the cold, hooves thudding with a rhythm that carried all the way to Jesse's bones. They reined in just beyond the gate. Virgil smiled without warmth. A coil of rope looped over his saddle horn. "Cartwright," he called, voice carrying easy in the still air. "I've come for what's mine." Jesse stepped forward, the wood of the rifle smooth beneath his palm. "You've come for what you lost." Virgil's eyes narrowed. "That woman and those girls belong to the Kemp family by blood. You got no claim." "Blood don't give a man the right to kill," Jesse said. Virgil chuckled low. "Kill? Ain't planning on killin'. Just talking I'm somewhere they won't stir up more trouble." "Like you took their father?" Jesse asked, his voice hardening. A murmur rose from the hill above. Jesse hadn't seen the handful of townsfolk gathering, drawn by the sound of horses at daybreak. Reverend Thatcher was among them, his black coat a stark mark against the pale grass. He stepped forward, speaking loud enough for every ear. "You know as well as I do, Virgil Kemp, that these women were left to die. That's no kinship worth claimin'." The words carried a ripple through the small crowd. Virgil shifted in his saddle, jaw tight. "This ain't their concern." "Looks like it is now," Jesse said. For a beat, nothing moved. Then Virgil swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the cold earth. His hand brushed the rope at his side, but his eyes were fixed on Jesse. "Step aside." Jesse didn't. "You want them, you'll have to come through me." Virgil's smirk was brief and ugly. He lunged, fast for a man his size, but Jesse was faster. The butt of the rifle cracked against Virgil's jaw, the sound sharp as splitting wood. Virgil staggered back, dropping the rope, a dark bloom spreading across his cheek. One of the other riders reached for his gun, but froze when Jesse turned the barrel on him. The second rider hesitated, caught between loyalty and self-preservation. The crowd on the hill was growing louder now, half calling for Virgil to stand down, half just hungry for the spectacle. Sheriff Briggs pushed through the onlookers, his badge catching the light. "That's enough," he barked. "Virgil Kemp, you're under arrest for attempted murder and unlawful detainment." Virgil spat into the dirt. "You gonna take the word of a ranch hand over mine?" "I'll take the word of half the town who just saw you try to beat him down," Briggs said, stepping in close. With a practiced motion, he wrenched Virgil's hands behind his back and snapped iron cuffs around his wrists. The other riders backed off, their horses shifting uneasily. Briggs led Virgil toward his own mount, shoving him up into the saddle. "You'll have your say in front of a judge," the sheriff said, voice flat. Jesse lowered the rifle, feeling the ache in his arm where the blow had jarred him. His eyes found Mara, standing now in the cabin doorway with the girls at her sides. Sadie's chin was lifted high. Lila's hand gripped her mother's dress in a white-knuckled hold. The crowd began to drift away, their whispers trailing like the dust from the departing horses. The ridge was empty again, the morning light spilling unbroken over the fields. Jesse walked back to the cabin, each step easing the coil of tension in his chest. Inside, the warmth from the stove met him like a held breath finally released. Mara's eyes searched his face, as if to measure what the morning had taken from him. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said, voice low. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Sadie stepped forward, slipping her small hand into his. "We can stay?" she asked. Jesse glanced toward Mara, who gave the faintest nod. "You can stay," he told them. Later, when the girls were settled and the cabin was quiet, Jesse stepped outside. The abandoned train station stood far off against the horizon, its roofline barely visible through the morning haze. He thought of the day he found them there, ropes cutting skin, breath ragged in the dust, and how places meant for endings could sometimes mark the start of something worth keeping. He rested his hand on the porch rail, the grain worn smooth by years of weather. The wind carried the faint sound of a hammer from some distant ranch, the world going on as it always had. Yet here, in this small patch of earth, something had shifted. Some knots, he thought, are meant to hold a thing together. Others are meant to be cut. And sometimes, a man's worth is measured by knowing the difference. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.